Okay, welcome everybody to today's class. I'll make sure there's no light on the board. A couple over there as well, but I think that'll have to do. Seems to be a little bit of light here and here, but we'll just do our best. Now, today we're going to do phrases and clauses. I decided to do this class because somebody asked me a question yesterday, and it was someone who wanted to buy this book. And of course, yeah, I do say to people when they say, I've got a question about this subject or that subject, where can I find more information about that particular topic? And I very often say, do have a look at my book, because obviously my answer is probably in this book, the answer to your question. And so yeah, I'm going to keep recommending this book and not someone else's book, because this is where my answers to your questions lie. And so phrases and clauses, I'm trying to show you that there's a way that you can analyze any sentence and break it up into its component parts. And the component parts are words, and these words have certain roles and functions, such as adjectives, nouns, verbs, adverbs, conjunctions, prepositions. But we could split them up into slightly bigger units. For example, 2 or 3 words together can be called a phrase. And we call something a phrase when it doesn't have a subject and a verb. And it really is as simple as that. If it doesn't have a subject and a verb, it's a phrase and not a clause. So this means that in any sentence, you're going to have a hierarchy. And the hierarchy in grammar is all about completion. The more complete an idea is, the more it becomes closer to a complete sentence, a complete thought, the higher up the hierarchy it is, okay? And this is why right at the top of the hierarchy, we have main clause. Main clause is at the top of the hierarchy because it's complete, because you can put a full stop at the end of it. Okay, so that's right at the top of the hierarchy. And then lower down the hierarchy, you have things like subordinate clauses, which are incomplete. That's a good reason why they're lower down than main. And then even less complete than a subordinate clause is any type of phrase. And it's even less complete because it doesn't have a subject and a verb, whereas subordinate clauses do have subjects and verbs, even though they're incomplete. So I want you to understand there is a hierarchy, and that as long as we follow these ideas, we will be able to find any sentence and break it up into its component parts and understand how exactly it's functioning. And so the student asked me, how can that be a relative clause? It's a dependent clause. How can it be both at the same time? Something along those lines, or that's how I understood it, of how can that be a subordinate clause and a relative clause? How is that even possible? Well, I want to make one thing really clear right now. Subordinate clauses could be noun clauses. You probably can't see that because of the light. Someone's going to moan. Let me run around trying to sort that out. Yeah, is that a little bit better? No? Anyway, subordinate clauses, you could split them up into at least 3 different types. And the middle one is a relative clause, an adjective clause. Yeah? So don't think that relative clauses are something different from subordinate clauses. They're not. Yeah? We've got 2 different types at the start, main and subordinate, a complete clause and an incomplete clause. And the main clauses are just main clauses, that's all they are. But the subordinate clauses could be functioning adjectively, they could be functioning adverbially, or they could even be functioning as nouns. Okay? So that means that a relative clause, which I keep telling you is a big fat adjective, you've probably heard me say that before if you've been watching these lessons, a relative clause is an adjectival clause, and adjectival clauses are incomplete. They are clauses that start with a who, a which, a that, a whose, a whom, a where, a when, or a why. They're incredibly important, even though they're very rarely taught at schools, but they're incredibly important, and they are always incomplete, and they always have a subject and a verb, so they're a clause. They describe a noun, so they're adjectival, but they are subordinate clauses. So don't think there's a difference between a subordinate clause and an adjectival clause. There isn't. A subordinate clause is the name we give for any incomplete clause, and incomplete clauses include noun clauses, they include adjectival clauses, and they include adverbial clauses. Now, how do you know what you've got? Well, Noticing the relative clauses is pretty easy if you know this list of relative pronouns, who, which, that, whose and whom, and relative adverbs, where, when and why. Okay? No, it definitely can't be. You will not get something which is a relative clause and a noun clause at the same time. You'd have to give me an example for me to check that, but certainly not. How could it be doing two things at the same time? How could it be functioning as a noun and as an adjective at the same time? That doesn't make much sense to me. So a noun clauses usually start with what, how and that, with those three words. Now the that is very often omitted. Okay, so they don't have to have these words at the start. But anytime you have he said X, or she explained Y, or he knew W, yeah, you're going to have that letter that I'm putting at the end is going to be a noun clause, maybe. It doesn't have to be, but very often it is. He said that he was going to pick me up at 7:30. That he was going to pick me up at 7:30 is a noun clause. It's a noun clause because it's got a subject and a verb, and it's functioning as the object of the verb. And that's what nouns do. They function as the object of the verb, or the subject of the verb, or the object of a preposition. So noun clauses are always subordinate. They'll never be complete because they are the subject or the object of a preposition. So how could they possibly be complete if they're always performing one of these three functions? And in that sense, noun clauses must be subordinate clauses. And yeah, the most common time, or the most obvious noun clause, is when you have it as the object of a verb. And it's very often the case with verbs of talking, like he said that he was going to pick me up at 6:30. Yeah, or he knew that I was already married. Yeah, something like that. And if you say that I was already married, that's a clause. It's functioning as a noun because it's what you knew. It's the object of a verb, so it must be functioning as a noun. So that's what a noun clause are. And yet they very often start with what and how and that as well, although the that may be omitted. So they're the noun clauses, and they've got to be one of these three things, otherwise they're not a noun. Yeah, that's what nouns are. They function in those three ways. So noun clauses are always subject or object of a preposition. Adjectival clauses are also subordinate, but they're relative clauses, and you're best off learning these ones to spot them. Yeah, but please do lots of exercises about defining and non-defining relative clauses. Plenty of exercises in this book, guys. Plenty of exercises in this book. If you're interested in buying a copy, send me an email, or put your email, or just look under the video and I will write where you can send your money, and I'll just send it straight to your email as a PDF. It's £12. But if you want to buy it as paperback, then it's on Amazon as well. And again, I'll put links under the video. But yeah, do lots of exercises about defining and non-defining, because you see these guys all the time. And lastly, you do get adverbial subordinate clauses, and usually these guys start with subordinating conjunctions. Yeah, and if you memorize those although, when, while, if, as soon as, those subordinating conjunctions, you'll easily spot these adverbial subordinate clauses. Yeah, but all three of these clauses are lower down the hierarchy than a main clause, because none of them are complete. They're never complete. You couldn't put a full stop at the end of any of them. Okay, whereas you could here. So this is at the top. Then you've got three different types of subordinate clauses, and they're all functioning differently. And then you've got four different types of phrases. Now, phrases don't have a subject and a verb. Phrases don't have a subject and a verb, whereas clauses do have a subject and a verb. And this is why they differ, and it's why phrases are right down at the bottom of the list. Now notice that clauses can function as nouns, adjectives and adverbs. They don't function as verbs, okay? And that's quite important. You don't see them functioning as verbs, but you do see them functioning as nouns, adjectives and adverbs. And phrases there is such a thing as a verb phrase, and that's the tricky one. We'll look at that in a second. But you also get noun phrases. Now, noun phrases are just any string of words where the most important word is a noun, and it's going to always be functioning, although we'll talk about one exception, as subject or object of a preposition, because that's what nouns do. So that's a noun phrase, and we'll certainly talk about apositives in a second as well, because they're important for noun phrases. Okay, there's also adverbial phrases, which are phrases functioning adverbially, so describing a verb or describing an adjective or describing another adverb or describing the whole clause. And adjectival phrases, okay? And with these, if we call these the four main groups, yeah, because here we're talking about function. We're talking about phrases that function as verbs, phrases that function as nouns, phrases that function as adjectives, and phrases that function as adverbs. But we could split these four phrase groups. We're going to talk about prepositional phrases as well, absolute phrases, apositive phrases, and participle phrases. But I want to make it clear that those four, yeah, absolutes, apositives, prepositionals, and participles, they're just subgroups. They're subgroups of the main four. The main four are the four functional groups, but these four are just subgroups, and they're other types of phrase. But I mean, all of these, the apositive is a noun phrase. The absolute phrase is both noun phrase and adverbial phrase, and that's why I've drawn it between the two. And it's a tricky type of phrase. It's probably the most complex, probably just as complex as a participle phrase, but I've put it here because it's a noun phrase in that the head word is a noun. The most important word there is a noun, but it's functioning adverbially in the sense that it's telling us how the main clause happened. And so it is adverbial and noun at the same time. And you have to be aware of these subtle nuances in grammar. Now, prepositional phrase is anything starting with a preposition, right? But prepositional phrases sometimes function as adjectives and sometimes function as adverbs. So you need to be aware of that. Once again, loads of this stuff in this book, please. Try the exercises if you want more practice with this kind of stuff. Now, prepositional phrases always start with a preposition, or they have the preposition as the head word again. You might get an adverb in before the preposition, but it usually starts with a preposition. And participle phrases, where the head word is a participle, usually they're adjectival. However, I've got to be honest and say that participle phrases have an adverbial function as well. They really do. They often tell us the when, the where, the how, or the why of the verb, and in that sense they have an adverbial meaning in there as well, although not always. So be aware that participles are somewhere between adverbial and adjective, although often they're just purely adjectival, but sometimes they're far more adverbial than they are adjectival, and that's something we need to be aware of. Now, I haven't mentioned the verb phrase yet, and it's because the verb phrase is the hardest one to deal with. It's easy to deal with when you've got a sentence like this. I got up, got out of bed, dragged a comb across my head. Now, with a sentence like this, you've clearly got three verb phrases. Got up, got out of bed, dragged a comb across my head. Yeah, you've clearly got that verb phrase, got up, that verb phrase, got out of bed, that verb phrase, dragged a comb across my head. And they're clearly verb phrases because they've clearly got a subject, they've clearly got a doer. And that's why these three are three verb phrases in a row. And of course, they're only a verb phrase when you don't take the subject into account, when you cover up the I. If you cover up the subject, you've got three verb phrases. With the subject, you've got a main clause that includes three verb phrases. But with the subject, you've clearly got a main clause. You've got everything you need to put a full stop at the end. Okay? So they're three verb phrases. But the reason why the verb phrase is hard is because verb phrases function not only as verbs. In this sentence, the verb phrases are functioning as verbs, and that's nice and simple and clear and easy. But the truth is that verb phrases function as gerunds. When they're functioning as nouns, we call them gerunds. That's the name we give them. A verb phrase functioning as a noun is a gerund. They can be participles, which means they're functioning as adjectives. If a verb phrase is functioning as an adjective, it's a participle. And you even get 2+ infinitive verb phrases. In fact, you see them everywhere. They're all over the English language. And 2+ infinitives can function as nouns, they can function as adjectives, they can function as adverbs. So 2+ infinitive verb phrases are very, very tricky. They're really hard. And this is why, you know, we could call it a verb phrase, but it's it's almost never functioning as a verb. I mean, it's usually the object of a verb, in which case it's kind of like a noun, kind of functioning like a noun, but it can describe a noun, in which case it's functioning like an adjective, like an opportunity to win. To win is describing the opportunity. And so these 2 plus infinitives are tricky. They're hard. Be aware that they're the ones that will probably trip you up. Keep an eye out for them and think about how they're functioning in each case. They've never got a doer, and so they're never verbs in that old sense of the word, of they've got a doer, but they do function as nouns, adjectives and adverbs as well. So I want you to think in these terms, these phrases and clauses, when we're looking at the next few pages, because in the next class I think I'll try and do this on my computer, just open up something like, well, any old book, and we'll carry on going through in terms of phrases and clauses, because I want to show you how to identify these guys, and how to do so quickly and clearly, because it does help you to work out exactly what the writer's saying. Okay, so if anyone would like to know more about this information, please, yeah, do buy my book. I obviously put a lot of this stuff in there, and it's full of exercises. It really is a self-study book, and so you can watch the lessons. I'll obviously be making more aimed at this kind of stuff as well. And even though you might think that this isn't aimed at TEFL, it is actually aimed at TEFL. Anyone who wants to improve their writing as a TEFL student really ought to be thinking in terms of phrases, clauses, grammar. It really will help your writing improve, but it helps your speaking improve as well. So if you want to improve your speaking too, then this is a great way as well. Okay, thanks everybody for watching. I'll try and get another video up over the next few days, and I hope to see you all soon.